It was a quiet summer evening in Florida when an event unfolded that would send shockwaves through the local community. On June 9, 2014, a 91-year-old woman reported something unimaginable, a terrible crime that would forever change her life. She told authorities that she had been sexually assaulted in her own home. The woman, who was shaken and scared, described her attacker as a young male. She believed he was someone much younger than she had ever imagined. The woman, despite her age and frailty, was able to provide authorities with a detailed account of what had happened. Her injuries were severe, facial wounds that would later require medical attention, along with a deep cut on her arm. She described the horror of the attack, telling officers that the person who had hurt her spoke Spanish. These crucial details immediately set the stage for an investigation that would soon spiral into an even bigger mystery. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they quickly went to work securing the area. They combed through the house, collecting every piece of evidence that could shed light on the crime. There were bloodstains found on the victim's bed and torn clothing that had been left behind in the chaos of the attack. Neighbors were interviewed, but no one seemed to have seen anything unusual. The authorities were at a standstill, trying to piece together the puzzle of what had happened in the woman's home. As detectives gathered evidence, one name began to surface. A 14-year-old boy, Jesse Stone, became a person of interest. His name was not entirely unfamiliar to the authorities. A red stain had been spotted on his clothes when he was seen nearby the scene of the crime. At first it seemed like a small detail, but it was enough to raise questions. Was he connected to the crime? The investigators weren't sure, but they needed to find out. DNA evidence played a crucial role in this case. When Stone's DNA was found on the victim's underwear, it became clear that he might have been involved in the attack. The discovery of the DNA evidence led to Jesse's detention, and soon, detectives would have the opportunity to question him directly. Stone was brought in for questioning, and the atmosphere in the room was tense. His grandmother, who had raised him, was there too. Detectives knew they had to approach Jesse carefully, using both the facts of the case and emotional appeals to get him to confess. They presented the evidence to him, focusing on the DNA that had been found and its undeniable connection to him. The pressure was on. At first, Jesse denied any involvement. He insisted that he had never been near the elderly woman's house, despite the overwhelming evidence. He claimed that he was nowhere near the scene at the time of the assault, but things weren't adding up. Detectives had video footage of him walking through the neighborhood, close to where the crime had taken place. The video evidence painted a different story than what Jesse was telling. But the most important part of the investigation came from the victim herself. The elderly woman, though clearly shaken, was able to identify Jesse Stone. She told the detectives that she knew him as Randy John, a name she had heard before. She explained that he had visited her home on several occasions in the past. Her recollections were vivid as she described the attack, recounting how she had prayed during the terrifying ordeal and pleaded for help. She identified him, and the weight of her words echoed in the room. The detectives, sensing that Jesse might be close to breaking, used a new tactic. They began showing him photos of the elderly woman's injuries. They wanted him to understand the pain he had caused and the severity of the crime. They appealed to his emotions, urging him to come forward and admit the truth for the sake of the victim. It was a powerful moment, one that would haunt Jesse for the rest of his life. As the interrogation continued, Jesse's grandmother, who had been silent up to that point, suddenly spoke up. She had been listening to everything in the room, and she was shocked by the gravity of what was happening. She confronted Jesse, her voice trembling. She called him out on his history of lying and urged him to tell the truth. She was devastated. She had raised him, and now here he was, caught up in a crime so horrific that she could barely comprehend it. She told him that this was his chance to make things right. With every word, the pressure on Jesse mounted. Would he finally admit to the crime, or would he continue to deny his involvement? The room was filled with tension as the investigation reached its critical moment. The truth, whatever it was getting closer to the surface. As the room fell silent after his grandmother's emotional plea, Jesse Stone's body language shifted. He seemed uneasy, twisting in his seat, avoiding eye contact with both the detectives and his grandmother. The pressure was mounting, and the weight of the situation started to sink in. It was as if a heavy cloud had descended upon the room. The truth was just out of reach, and yet every new piece of evidence seemed to push Jesse closer to a confession. The detectives, seeing the change in his demeanor, decided to push harder. They knew Jesse was holding something back. The emotional appeals hadn't worked. Yet, it was time to bring in more of the evidence. They leaned forward, showing him the photos of the elderly woman's injuries once again. The images were graphic, portraying the pain and suffering she had endured. The photos were a harsh reminder of the cruelty of the crime, and they were meant to shake Jesse into facing reality. The detectives looked at Jesse, trying to gauge his reaction. His eyes flitted nervously from the photos to his grandmother, who was now silent, watching him closely. Her face, filled with both sadness and disbelief, seemed to convey a mix of love and hurt. Jesse was not just disappointing the detectives, he was also breaking his grandmother's heart. She had stood by him through thick and thin, but this was something no one could forgive. The emotional weight of the situation was undeniable. Jesse shifted again, this time his hands fidgeting with the cuffs on his wrists. The silence in the room was palpable, broken only by the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Finally, the detectives spoke again, but this time their tone was more direct. They told Jesse that the evidence didn't lie. His DNA had been found on the victim's clothing, and they had video footage placing him at the scene. The detectives emphasized that this was his chance to make things right, not just for himself, but for the elderly woman who had been traumatized by his actions. Still, Jesse didn't budge. His eyes dropped to the floor, his face a mixture of frustration and fear. He was cornered, but he refused to admit it. His mind was racing, but his lips remained sealed. He wasn't ready to come clean, not yet. The tension in the room thickened, and it seemed like Jesse was caught in a mental battle between what was right and what he had done. His grandmother, unable to hold back any longer, spoke again, her voice trembling. "Jesse, you have to tell the truth," she said softly, almost pleading with him. "Do you know how much hurt you're causing everyone?" Her words were a cry for help, a desperate attempt to reach him, to make him understand the severity of his actions. Jesse flinched at the sound of her voice, and for the first time in the interrogation, he looked directly at her. But there was no apology in his gaze, only confusion and fear. Detectives noticed the change in Jesse's eyes and decided to try one final tactic. They decided to confront him with the reality of what his life could look like if he continued to lie. They told him that denying the truth wouldn't make the evidence go away. In fact, it would only make things worse for him in the long run. They explained that there was no escape, no way out of the situation except through honesty. If Jesse admitted to what he had done, maybe, just maybe, there could be a chance for some redemption. The room was still. The detectives watched Jesse closely, and his grandmother held her breath. Would he break? Would he finally confess to the crime he had committed? Or would he continue down the path of denial, even in the face of overwhelming evidence? Jesse sat motionless for what felt like an eternity. The weight of his grandmother's words, the detectives' relentless questioning, and the undeniable evidence all seemed to be closing in on him. He rubbed his face with his hands, as if trying to wash away the guilt, but it wasn't going to disappear. His mind raced, and his heart pounded in his chest. He knew that the moment of truth was fast approaching, but just as Jesse seemed to be on the brink of admitting what he had done, something unexpected happened. His grandmother spoke again, this time with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Jesse, you're breaking my heart," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Do you even realize what you've done? This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the victim. It's about making things right." The words cut deep, and Jesse flinched again. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. The walls around him seemed to crumble, but still he stayed silent. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, and the photos of the victim's injuries haunted him. But no confession came. Instead, Jesse seemed to retreat even further into himself, his gaze shifting from one corner of the room to the other. His grandmother, devastated by his lack of response, sank back in her chair, her face a mask of sorrow. The detectives exchanged a look of frustration. They had done everything they could to break Jesse, but he was still holding on to his secrets. The interrogation was at a standstill, but they knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The detectives would have to come up with a new strategy. Time was running out, and the investigation could not remain at this impasse forever. They had to find a way to make Jesse see that the truth was his only option. But as the interrogation dragged on, it seemed like Jesse was determined to keep the truth locked inside, even as it threatened to tear his life apart. The silence in the room grew heavier as the hours passed. Jesse's grandmother sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes cast downward. It was clear that she was exhausted, emotionally drained, but she wasn't ready to give up on him just yet. The detectives knew she had been a critical part of the interrogation, her emotional appeals playing a pivotal role in trying to get Jesse to confess. But now, it seemed like even her words weren't enough to break through the wall he had built around himself. Jesse, on the other hand, remained mostly silent. He shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out of this overwhelming situation. The weight of the evidence, the photos of the victim, and the constant questioning were slowly taking their toll. But he wasn't ready to crack. His lips remained sealed, and every attempt to get him to speak seemed to only make him more defensive. The detectives exchanged glances, both frustrated and weary. They knew the strategy had to change. They could no longer rely solely on emotional appeals or the hard evidence. They needed to dig deeper to get to the root of what was stopping Jesse from speaking the truth. They needed to find a way to make him realize the magnitude of what he had done, not just in terms of the crime, but in terms of the impact it was having on everyone involved, especially his own family. One of the detectives leaned forward, breaking the silence with a softer, more contemplative tone. "Jesse," he began, "I know this is hard, I know you're scared, and I know you don't want to face what's happened, but you need to understand something." He paused for a moment, making sure Jesse was paying attention. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the victim, it's about your family, and it's about doing the right thing." Jesse's eyes flickered toward the detective, but he didn't speak. It was as if his mind was still racing, trying to process everything that was happening. The detective continued, his voice firm but compassionate. "You have a choice to make here, Jesse. You can either keep lying and make this worse for yourself, or you can come clean and take responsibility for what you've done. No one can make that decision for you, but you need to understand that the truth is always the best choice in the end. It might be hard now, but it's the only way to start making things right." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. There was a shift in the air, a subtle change that suggested Jesse was starting to wrestle with the weight of the detective's words. His fingers twitched, and he glanced briefly at his grandmother, who still sat quietly, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and hope. She had said everything she could, but now it was up to him. She knew it was time to let Jesse face his own choices. Then, the detectives took a different approach. They stopped speaking for a moment, allowing Jesse to sit with his thoughts. The only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the air conditioning, the occasional rustle of paper, and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. The room felt almost suffocating in its stillness. As the seconds stretched into minutes, Jesse's expression changed. The defensiveness, the resistance, it all seemed to be fading. His shoulders slumped and his eyes grew tired, as if the weight of the situation had finally caught up with him. The guilt, the fear, the uncertainty, it was all overwhelming, and it was becoming clear that Jesse couldn't carry it much longer. After what felt like an eternity, Jesse finally spoke. His voice was low and shaky, barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile and uncertain. The detectives remained silent, giving him the space he needed to continue. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I didn't want to do it. I didn't mean for it to go that far." There was a brief pause as Jesse's words sunk in. The detectives exchanged a quick glance, their faces a mix of hope and caution. They knew they were on the edge of something. Jesse was finally opening up, but they had to be careful not to push him too hard too fast. "I didn't plan it," Jesse added, his voice cracking. "I didn't even think it was going to happen. I don't know. It was like something took over, and I couldn't stop it." His hands were trembling now, and he wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, trying to regain some composure. "But I did it, and I don't know why. I don't know why I hurt her." The room felt heavy again, as Jesse's confession hung in the air. He was finally starting to admit what he had done, but his words were scattered, disjointed. It was as if the reality of what he had done was slowly sinking in, piece by piece. His grandmother, who had been sitting silently for so long, let out a soft sigh. She still hadn't said a word, but her eyes were filled with a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and maybe even a hint of disappointment. She had wanted to believe in Jesse, to trust that he would make the right choice. But now that he was admitting the truth, it was clear how deeply he had hurt her, and how deeply he had hurt the victim as well. The detectives leaned in slightly, encouraging Jesse to continue. "Take your time, Jesse," one of them said gently. "We're here to listen. Just tell us what happened." Jesse's eyes darted around the room as he gathered his thoughts. "It was just... She was there and I was angry. I don't even remember what set me off, but I don't know. I just did it. And when it was over, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to take it back." The room was silent again as the detectives processed his words. They had heard confessions before, but this one felt different. There was a rawness to it, a sense that Jesse was grappling with something much deeper than just the crime itself. It was clear that he was struggling with remorse, with shame, and with a profound sense of guilt. But the question remained: was this enough? Was this truly a confession, or was Jesse still holding back? His grandmother shifted slightly, her eyes never leaving him. She wanted to say something, but the words seemed to fail her. She had hoped, prayed even, that her grandson would find his way back from this. But now, as he sat before her, confessing to something so horrific, it felt like everything had changed. Would he ever be the same? Would they ever be able to forgive him? The tension in the room was almost unbearable as Jesse sat, trembling, his confession hanging in the air. The detectives exchanged another look. It was time to press forward, to get the full truth out of Jesse before he had the chance to retreat into silence again. "Jesse," one of the detectives said, his voice calm but firm, "we're getting there, but we need to know everything, every detail. What happened that night? How did it all go down?" Jesse's head dropped into his hands, and for a moment, it seemed like he might break down completely. The gravity of the situation had finally hit him full force. He had hurt someone. He had broken something inside of himself. And the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. But Jesse was still struggling to find the words. Would he be able to continue his confession, or would he retreat once again into silence? The room held its breath, waiting for his next move.